The presidential election in Taiwan, set for January 13th, is turning out to be a tight race between the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP's candidate, Lai Ching-te, more commonly known as William Lai, and the Kuomintang candidate, Ho Yu-yi. Any third or fourth candidate's run, including that of former Foxconn chief Terry Gou, that seems like a lost cause at this point. The most recent My Formosa poll, released on the 26th of December, gives William Lai an almost 10 percentage lead. That's his largest lead in the poll in recent months. But there are other polls which indicate that the gap is much narrower. The result will be unpredictable until at least election day. Now, for mainland China, both Lai Ching-te and Ho Yu-yi present a dilemma. A potential Lai victory would expose Beijing's strategy of trying to freeze out any DPP administration out of cross-strait relations. Now, that policy would have been rendered a failure because the DPP has been ruling Taiwan for the last 8 years, and 4 more years of the DPP would mean that Beijing's hold over affairs in Taipei is increasingly loosening, it's increasingly becoming a policy that's a failure. The DPP would demonstrate its ability to win elections without having to deal with Beijing. A Ho victory, on the other hand, is also problematic, maybe less so. Ho defies Beijing's expectations for a Kuomintang candidate. The KMT has traditionally been pro-Beijing. It's been less confrontational, particularly on the reunification question. On that question of reunification, the DPP has openly called for Taiwan's independence and rejected outright China's claims of reunification. Ho, on the other hand, has claimed that he would accept the 1992 consensus, that is Beijing's one precondition for any cross-straits negotiations to resume. He has also said that he would restart the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, or the ECFA, that was signed during the Ma Ying-jeou administration, which was a KMT administration more than 8 years ago. However, Ho does prioritize a strong defense against Beijing's increasingly military tactics and a potential invasion. He wants to amp up cooperation with the United States. He also places human rights front and center of cross-straits conversations. That's a topic that Beijing would rather not discuss. In a sense, regardless of whether Lai or Ho becomes the next president, the leadership in Taiwan will not be deferring to Beijing. China has had a tough time, particularly under the outgoing DPP president Tsai Ing-wen. When the DPP's Tsai Ing-wen was elected first in 2016, she had to show that she was ready for the job. She had to show her presidential temperament. Tsai's primary job was to demonstrate that she could maintain cross-strait stability. In her inauguration speech in 2016, Tsai Ing-wen claimed that she would safeguard the sovereignty and the territory of the Republic of China, and this will be according to the Constitution of the Republic of China. Now remember, the ROC's constitution is a one China constitution. Therefore, in a way, without saying it in as many words, she reiterated a rejection of independence for Taiwan. This was a tacit approval, this was not clearly spelled out, and that tacit approval was not good enough for Beijing. Another big question mark that hung over her was the 1992 consensus. Now, historically, the DPP, her party, had rejected the 1992 consensus. Tsai Ing-wen admitted that the 1992 consensus was a historic fact between Taipei and Beijing. However, her reconciliatory stand did not impress Beijing. Almost immediately after her election, Beijing froze her administration out of existing cross-straits talks. They also launched a vicious propaganda attack against her and her government. And rather than accepting that Taiwan had a new president, a president who was going to be around for a while, Beijing instead pushed Tsai to accept openly both the 1992 consensus and that she would abdicate the position of independence for Taiwan. That, of course, politically would have been impossible and unacceptable for Tsai's vote bank, which is primarily a green base. Now, in addition to this, Beijing had also tried to leverage cross-straits economic ties to try and punish Tsai Ing-wen and her administration through economic consequences, through an economic boycott of goods and services. Now, after a disastrous 2018 midterm election in which the DPP under Tsai Ing-wen lost more than half of the local governments, she then decided to turn to identity politics. This was a strategy that was successfully used by the very first DPP president, Chen Shui-bian, who, in a way, was Tsai's mentor in politics. Moreover, Beijing's crackdown in 2019 and 20 following the Hong Kong protests, that provided a crucial weapon to Tsai Ing-wen during the 2020 election campaign. The Taiwanese public was extremely concerned over the Hong Kong crackdown, and they became increasingly suspicious that Beijing would interfere in Taiwan as well. Now, Tsai Ing-wen in that election in 2020 beat her opponent, the KMT's Han Kuo-yu, by labeling him as a CCP agent. In her second term, Tsai Ing-wen developed a much more tougher position when it came to cross-strait ties. Beijing did not help its cause either, with repeated military provocations across the median line. There have been repeated attempts by both aircrafts as well as ships to cross into the Taiwan Air Defense Identification Zone. Taiwan claims that there have been more than 500 military incursions by China since 2020, when Tsai returned for a second term. And with each provocation, the belligerence of the rhetoric that was coming out of Beijing also increased. In August of 2022, the then US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in what was a highly anticipated but very controversial visit. She became the first Speaker of the US House of Representatives since Newt Gingrich back in the mid-1990s to openly visit Taiwan. There was, as expected, a furious reaction from Beijing. It immediately froze all congressional and military interactions with the United States. It even provoked a reaction from the usually moderate President Joe Biden. He said publicly that America's long-standing policy of strategic ambiguity needs to go. This was a break from more than 50 years of stated US position. It only made ties between Beijing and Washington even more frosty until in late 2023, when Biden and Xi Jinping met in California on the sidelines of the APEC summit. Now, in recent years, there's been a notable decline in Chinese identification in Taiwan. Now, this decline is a result of China's monopolization of the Chinese identity. Beijing's goal is to use Chinese nationalism, Chinese cultural appeal to try and draw Taiwan closer to the mainland. However, it has ended up backfiring, pushing Taiwan and Taiwanese people away. In fact, the Taiwanese are searching for an alternative Taiwanese identity to demonstrate how different they are from their mainland counterparts. Following its defeat in mainland China, if you go back into history in the mid-1940s, the Republic of China government relocated to Taiwan. This was in 1949. At that time, the PRC came into existence. However, the Kuomintang, which was the party that retained a devotion of the large majority of Chinese nationalists, in fact, the literal translation of KMT would be a congregation of Chinese nationalists. So the KMT made its single-point agenda in the first years that Taiwan became a separate entity. Their single-point agenda was to reconquer the mainland. Now, under this narrative, Taiwan is a part of overall China and not a separate entity which exists on its own. Taiwan's sovereignty was returned to the ROC after Japan surrendered in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. Remember, Taiwan had been a Japanese colony since the end of the Imperial War in 1895. So the Chiang Kai-shek government in Taiwan enforced more and more policies to promote Chinese culture in Taiwan. They wanted to preserve their claim that they and they alone are the legitimate government of all of China. The government renamed the streets in Taipei after Confucian virtues. There were places in the mainland after which streets have been named. Mandarin was made the official language. It was the only language which was taught in schools. Students who didn't speak Mandarin would face punishment. Non-Mandarin radio and television programs were limited to just a few hours a day. In fact, students were required to learn every detail of Chinese history and geography at school, including train stations, as well as, of course, the various wars that many dynasties in China have fought over the centuries. The international recognition of Taiwan rested on its claim to be the sole representative of China on the international stage. So the Republic of China's claim as the sole representative suffered a major blow in 1971. Back then, the United Nations adopted the General Assembly Resolution number 2758. This happened in October of 1971, which expressly stated that it will expel forthwith the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek from the place which they unlawfully occupy at the United Nations. That day, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the delegation to walk out of the United Nations. That proved to be a fatal mistake, because right after that, most Western countries, including the United States, dropped diplomatic recognition of Taiwan, and instead they started recognizing the government in Beijing as the sole representative of the Chinese people. Now, this was in line, it was in keeping with the One China policy, which the PRC government had been advocating all along. The retreat from the United Nations, the loss of recognition from countries like the US, Japan, and other Western countries was a significant blow to Chiang Kai-shek and his people. Beijing then launched an international offensive to establish diplomatic ties with foreign powers. It also claimed the Republic of China's seat at the United Nations. 40 years after those fateful events, this election once again shines the spotlight on the tiny island nation of just over 23 million people. Any future dispensation that the Taiwanese people will choose on January the 13th will have to deal with the thorny issue of cross-strait ties. Xi Jinping, in his New Year's Eve address, said that reunification will happen no matter what the cost, and that it's only a matter of time and it is inevitable. There is speculation in Chinese media, certainly, that by 2027, which is the 100th year of the founding of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, there will be pressure on some kind of military adventurism across the straits. But for a world that is already bogged down by two wars, one in Ukraine, the other in Gaza, is it ready for a third war? The 2024 Taiwan elections will hold some clues.